Hello again, everyone. Dave Rubenstein here, editor-in-chief of SD Times. And this is episode 2 of a SD Times Live micro webinar series looking at service virtualization. In case you missed episode 1, we talked about bridging testing gaps with service virtualization with Steve Filoni, who's with us here again today. He's Vice President of Continuous Testing Products at Perforce. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at overcoming test data challenges for efficient testing. Stephen, thanks for being with us again.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, as we know, test data can be messy. It's also, unfortunately, the lifeblood of your tests. And data is involved in that, and there can be sensitive data and things like that. So I guess these are some of the test data challenges that organizations face. And so we'll dive into a little bit about how they address those, and we'll look at that. So let's start with let's look at some best practices of what do people do, to create and manage their high quality test data that will enhance coverage and perhaps even accuracy.
Before I go into best practices, how about I want to say what I see most companies doing. Most
Oh, okay.
companies are not doing best practices.
Well, that's true.
So I see two things. One, companies wait for their DBAs to give them production data. And they wait to the last minute to ask for the production data. And then the DBAs have the rest of their day jobs to do. And so then they'll take a week, 2 weeks to get this data. So then they'll eventually get this data that's not scrubbed or anything. And then they'll use that data.
Yeah.
That's great. But then they'll decide, I don't ever want to wait again. So they will use that same data forever, never changing that data again. I was recently at a conference, and we were talking about test data. And I asked this one company, because they were talking about so many things about how often should we refresh. And I said, so how often do you refresh your data? And their answer was, it's been 5 years and we've never refreshed the data.
That's crazy.
5 years. 5 years. I'm like, well, I guess we know your product works for Jane Doe, because you've been testing with Jane Doe forever. Good for you. So when we go down, so that's how we see. Oh, and then other people are like, oh no, we don't use production data. Okay, so we don't use production data. That's no, it's too risky. So we've created data. Well, how did you create the data? By hand. Okay. How do you know it's the right data? That's the data that we created. And again, they use that same data and they don't ever refresh it. So that's what I see a lot of the time. And then when I go to these customers and I ask them, do you have a test data problem? They will always answer no. So what is best practices? Best practices is you want to refresh your data as often as basically you're changing your database. That would be the minimum, bare minimum of how often you should refresh your data. That data should be coming from, obviously, I would say production, because that gives you your right mix, the right balance of the types of data. And you have to ensure that the data you're grabbing is masked. So that means take away, mask all the PII information. Have that data refreshed. Now, the other thing you want to do is once you have that data, you do want to understand the data a little bit, so to ensure that you have the right type of data for the types of tests you are running to ensure that your test will succeed. Good stat. Over 25% of tests fail because of incorrect data.
Wow.
And I was talking to a large shoe company, won't say who, and I mentioned that stat. And his response to me was, it's way over 25%.
Wow.
Yeah. So test data, as you said, is the lifeblood of tests. And when you're thinking that 25, at least 25% of tests fail because of test data, think about all the wasted time because you don't know it's failed because of that test data. That means you got to analyze those results and come to that conclusion. Just think of all that wasted time.
Well, absolutely. So when does automation get introduced to the process? And I guess that would be used, of course, to keep the data refreshed and updated and like that.
Yes. So actually, so there's a few pieces of the automation. So when I said the best practice is to make sure you're grabbing it as often as you're changing the database and mass, there's the other part of that is when you are changing your database, when you are making changes, you're either modifying the database or you're changing functionality. Now you don't have that data in production because it's now a new function. So along with your masked data from production, you need the ability to create synthetic data because all that data that you have might not match what you actually need to test of that new feature. So you need to combine that with synthetic data. Now, one of the areas when you asked about the automation is if you are creating synthetic data, you want to make sure that you change the synthetic data. You don't want to always test, as I mentioned earlier, with Jane Doe. You don't want to test with the same thing
Right.
over and over again because all you've done is validated that it works for that one thing.
Mhm.
So one of the other best practices with automation is every time you run that test, regenerate the synthetic data so that it changes up. So John Doe, Jane Smith, Uri Paxton, whoever, right? So that you're having a lot of different things that match your data rules. So you have a lot of different areas for positive. But the other beauty about synthetic data is when I said data rules, you can generate negative data sets. In the last episode, I talked about negative testing. I will harp on negative testing till I die because people just do not do it. So synthetic data, you can generate negative data sets. And so that enables you, without any thinking, you don't have to think about it, gets you a whole new set of tests because you generated negative tests. So automation will do that as well. And then what you want is you want to set up a pipeline from production. Obviously, you have to get it approved by your operations, security, but you want a pipeline. So you go beyond that minimum I talked about every time your database changes. And you're constantly getting a stream of new data from production. And so you automate from production so you don't have to wait any longer for the DBAs to give you the data. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So let me just, as we're coming up on time, let me just ask you a final
Oh,
question. So people who are, evaluating tools and technologies for doing this, how do they make those decisions and, how do they specifically target overcoming their challenges?
so it's a good question. One, you really have to fully understand what are your needs? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to grab terabytes and petabytes of data? Are you just trying to create synthetic data? Like what are you trying to achieve? And so once you understand what your requirements are, then you have to look for vendors that obviously can accomplish those goals. I would say you're looking for a vendor that can take stuff from production and mask it, but at the same time, you want a vendor that can create synthetic data for you. Now, the one other piece I didn't mention about automation, once you bring your data into production or into pre-production, what happens? You end up having multiple test environments, multiple development environments. So everyone's copying that same data over and over again. So now you just have this data multiplication issue and database size issue. It becomes ridiculous. If you're using virtual databases, you end up having one central database that everyone shares, and you have these small virtual databases that you can bring up and down very easily because they're small. Only changes get put in these virtual databases. So that will increase your ability to do automation, to find changes, to reset, to send bugs and everything over to developers to fix things. So I would also say you want to look for a vendor that can handle that type of situation. So it's not just the masking, but the virtual databases as well as the synthetic data.
Great. All right. Once again, Steve Filoni, Vice President of Continuous Testing Products at Perforce. Thanks so much again for your time today. Folks, I'll ask
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. I'll ask you to join us next time, folks. We'll be talking about automating your CI/CD in testing and how that's going to work. By the way, now episodes 1 and 2 are available for on-demand viewing on the sdtimes.com website. So feel free to visit it and share with your friends and watch it over and over again. So until next time, again, I'm Dave Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times. So long.